All right, let's go ahead and take on, I think, one of the biggest issues that people are talking about in the state of Michigan is education. And so I'm going to go over to Aaron for our first questions on education.
Right.
Yeah, we heard from several people in our audience who had questions about education. Judith specifically wanted to know what your plans are for schools. So do you believe that schools in Michigan have the resources they need to succeed to serve all students, including those with special needs? And do you think that our schools right now are funded equitably?
Well, the issues that face our schools are way, way bigger than funding. Of course, you can always do with additional resources, and economic growth has created an environment of growth and resources for schools, as has paying down long-term debt and liabilities. I mean, we have reformed the system in a lot of ways to where we're creating a much, much better future for the dollars actually reaching the classroom. There's decades, literally, my entire lifetime of neglect of the long-term liabilities just ate into what was supposed to be for the classroom. And so a lot of the groundwork has been laid and the foundation has been laid for the resources, the classroom-based resources to get the majority of the economic growth of the future. But there are some areas where I think there's a lot of work to do, specialty services in particular. Some students have particular or intensive challenges and needs. I formed the Special Education Task Force because I was concerned that with all this debate on education overall, and it seemed like Republicans, Democrats, nobody was talking about special education, the kids that really have the largest obstacles in front of independence for themselves and self-determination of their lives in front of them. And it's a big number. I asked the group to estimate what the difference is between what is needed and what is provided today, and it's about $700 million around the state. Now, when you consider that the school aid fund is now upwards of around $14 billion, keep in mind we're talking in massively large numbers here, but still $700 million is a lot. They came up, the task force that I led came up with several recommendations, and many of those either have been or are in the process of being implemented. But ultimately, the funding formula itself for special education needs to change. The difference between the highest funded special education district and the lowest funded education district, keeping in mind that they're still property tax based in a big way, unlike the rest of education, is about tenfold. Right? There's a 10 times difference between the highest and the lowest. And so some kids get a lot of services and other kids don't get much at all, depending on where they live. And that's something that has to be rectified. That's why I put together the task force report, and I have fully, there's heavy lifts in that, and I've fully adopted it as my platform because we can't afford to leave anybody behind.
So you talked about some inequitable distribution of funds as far as special education, but the basic funding structure we have for schools, the $7,800 roughly per child that the state sends to each school, whether that be a district school or a charter school, is that basic system, is it an equitable way of funding schools?
Well, that's the base foundation allowance, and there are a lot of additional categorical funding streams for kids that have more intensive needs or at-risk kids and other programs. But there has been ever since Proposal A, which closed the majority of the gap between schools, there has been still a gap in there for these out-of-formula districts. What we have been doing throughout the entire administration is increasing the lower funded schools twice as much as the higher funded schools, and we've closed that gap about 50%. I believe about half of that gap has been closed now. And keeping on that same formula is important for the future, because when you put the different schools on an equal playing field, I think it's the first step. But we've been talking about money, right? Everybody always wants to talk about money, but if you look at the states that have done really well, and I like to look at Tennessee because Tennessee went from way behind to just performance much better than most of the rest of the nation, and if you look at what they did, one of the components that is very different than what happens here is the way that they support their teachers. Now I say support the teachers, everybody thinks money, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. That's not what they did. And I'm sure that they do support their teachers financially, but the big difference was professional development, teacher coaching, teacher training, helping good teachers become great teachers and great teachers become even greater teachers, to equip teachers with the latest and greatest in research and best practices and getting it into the classroom quicker. That whole system for making that work is very intentional and robust. And that's something that I'm really excited about, the difference that it could make here in the school, and a new mission for the Department of Education, which today is just is mainly a compliance organization. And I think it would be much better serve schools if it was a collection of best practice and trainers and professional developers, and a cadre of trainers in all different specialty areas that can spread across our state and be that type of support network.
So if I could ask you a little bit about how we measure success in schools. The state's current, given that test scores are often driven by socioeconomic and other factors, do you think the state's current accountability system is giving parents a fair and accurate measure of how our schools are doing?
I think that we have an overemphasis on the testing today as compared to what is needed. Now, that's not to say you're not going to have testing. Of course you're going to have testing. You're going to have some standardized testing. But kids aren't standard. At the end of the day, we're preparing kids for life. And there are a lot of different pathways to being successful in life. And when you try to derive everything according to a standardized testing process, you're treating kids who are not standard as though they are standard. And so kids bring different types of challenges with them to school. And that has to be taken into consideration, not just for how we measure whether a school is being successful, but also the types of interventions that we provide. So it's this idea of making sure that the intervention fits the kid instead of the kid having to fit the intervention that happens to be available. When we talk about reading, it's frustrating where all I hear people talk about is reading coaches. Reading coaches are good for some kids, but the majority of kids that are struggling with reading, that's not all they need. And so that's a component, but it's like oversimplifying a very pervasive problem. And it could be a child that has dyslexia. It needs a particular type of an approach, a very specialized approach. It could be that the child has a vocabulary issue. If you're reading, the child might be able to read, but if they don't know the words that they're reading, they're not going to test high in comprehension. So in that case, you need vocabulary work. In other cases, they might need help with phonics. But if we're providing a one-size-fits-all intervention and never really getting to the root of what is causing the problem for this child being behind in the first place, the intervention won't work.
So I realize you're talking about intervention of specific students, but when it comes to state policy, obviously the state's dealing at a much sort of broader level. And when we talk about state intervention in education, one of the things we often talk about is school closings and using test scores to decide which schools should be open and which schools shouldn't. What role do you think the state should be playing? Should the state be playing a role in deciding whether or not schools should close, or should the state be?
There's absolutely an accountability role that the state needs to play, but I look at it as a very long-term partnership process. And you might get to a point at the end of the day when it's just, you've been through all the different possibilities, you just can't make the types of changes that need to be made. But it should be earlier intervention and prevention of school closing, as opposed to, instead of having a school closing process, why not have a school improvement process that serves as a prevention of the need to close schools in the first place. And that is, I'll always resort back to the individual student approach, but collectively that's really what it's about. I mean, if you do well with individual students, you're going to have a good outcome as a whole for the school. And that's why I'm just concerned about this overemphasis on testing. Preparing a kid to take a test is not the same as preparing them to be successful in life. And while again I'll acknowledge you have to do some testing, that's not what it's about. It shouldn't be that is ultimately the thing, right? The test is not the point of it. The child learning is the point. And you can't always measure that in the exact same way. And frankly, I'm not sure that we should, because there are so many different pathways that a child could take to being successful in life. And so most of us, we have strengths and we have weaknesses, and we build our lives around the things that we're good at, right? The things we're interested in, the things that drive us. And I think about when I went to school, what got me up in the morning, why I went to school, was music. It was music. I had a music class, and there was this one girl in one of my classes too. We've been married for 22 years now, but I mean, it was a thing that had me motivated. I was a better math student because I had choir class. I was a better science student because I had theater. I mean, that's what I was passionate about, and that's the part that I'm determined in my education white paper that I put out is that we have to get away from this one-size-fits-all approach where kids are exploring their passions. And the education is a whole different scenario when the child is passionate about something that's happening in their education day. When we find that, I think that's really where you have that internal motivation of a student, which is like the missing link when a student is really struggling. If they're struggling and they're going to school and there's no part of school that's interesting or exciting or where they feel like they're successful at, then the task of a teacher to get that student motivated to go out and learn and overcome those barriers, it becomes so much harder than if there's that thing that drives the student to be there and to want to be there.
Steve, you have a question about DPSCD.
Yes, Detroit Public Schools Community District, the largest district in the state, recently released a facilities report showing that it would cost $500 million to upgrade school facilities to bring them up to current standards. But because of past deals with the state, the district is not able to borrow money to pay for those renovations like any other district would. What is Lansing's role in upgrading these traditional public schools in the city of Detroit? Or should the state allow the district to fundraise like other districts?
Well, I think that first of all, the work that the state did to relieve Detroit of a very significant amount of debt that accumulated over years has given them operational room to provide programming that is better than they ever could have done without the state help and assistance. When it comes to the debt management, I think that there is an openness to taking different approaches to facility upgrades in partnership with the state in terms of the way that they borrow money. It's going to be a little bit different. I mean, when the legislature made a very substantial appropriation to relieve debt, it's natural to expect that there's not just going to be wide open ability to just go out there and take out all that debt again. And so working with the professionals in our Treasury Department, I think there is room for that discussion. I believe that signals have been sent, that the door is open for those discussions on how they might be able to borrow some money to upgrade facilities. Now, $500 million, I don't think that's that just going out for $500 million bond offering or something like that is particularly realistic given where the district is right now. But doing facility improvements to get them to the standards that are required for the education system, I believe that's doable. And as governor, I absolutely would work with the Detroit Public School District or Detroit Community Schools to make that happen.
Is it possible that the state could also set money aside specifically for school upgrades in Detroit Public Schools?
Well, I don't think that it's particularly likely that there's going to be some sort of specific set aside for one school district. To the extent that the state decides it needs to help in facilities like with hardening of schools, for example, and communication systems for schools and campus-wide monitoring and secure entryways and that sort of thing. Those types of appropriations are the sorts of things that are made, that when the state gets involved, that they're made available to everybody.
Hassan?
Should Michigan change laws regarding how charter schools are governed and funded?
No, I don't think that the ways that charter schools are either funded or established today is the problem. The key is that we need to have the same accountability standards across the board, no matter which public schools we're talking about. The thing about charter schools is that, I mean, they can only survive if parents believe that they're a better option than their other options that are available. And the idea of having parents in the driver's seat, I just think they're in a better position than anybody else to determine what is best for their kids. And so taking away options from parents is definitely not something I would favor.
What about funding? Should money allocated for public schools be used to fund charter schools?
Charter schools are public schools, and I think they should be funded the same way as public schools, as traditional public schools. So charter public schools and traditional public schools, I think, should be funded with the same type of system.
Aaron.
Should there be any changes at all to the way the charter schools are overseen and authorized?
Well, I think there's always room for improvement in the accountability for performance and results. I'll go back though to this expectation that our schools across the board should, whether they're traditional public schools or charter public schools, that we should hold them to the same standards.
Sandra.
I wanted to ask a little bit about higher education, the cost of it specifically for colleges and universities in Michigan. Is it too high? Is it prohibitive? What can the governor's office do about that, and what kind of policies would you have in office?
It is too high, and I think one of the problems, we're talking at a macro level, and let's talk about some practical things. First of all, we have convinced a couple of generation of kids of the lie that there's only one definition of success. And so if you're a parent and your child doesn't go to a traditional university, then we've convinced people that they're somehow a failure as a parent, and the child is failing, or they take a consolation prize. I hear well-meaning people all the time say, well, not everybody's cut out for college, and those kids can go into the trades. The problem with that well-meaning statement is that it reinforces the false assertion that non-college post-high school education, because post-high school education is required, but non-college post-high school education somehow less. So what happens is you have this system that's like this service that is out there, and they have the market, right? So they're the definition of success. And if you are able to, in any other market, convince the entire public that if you don't buy what I'm selling, if you don't come and buy what I'm selling, your life is ruined. Parents, if your kids, or you don't buy this for your kids, you are a failure as a parent. If you had that market power, you could charge anything that you wanted, and people would line up to pay it. They would borrow money to pay it, and in fact, that's what's happening. And so the first thing I think we need to do is to show kids all the options that they could do with their life, and that's going to include competency-based education, certificate-based education, community colleges, universities, and apprenticeships, and across the board, so many different things. So the first thing is to add in competition to this equation, where all of the options are on the table and universities are competing for kids instead of kids competing for universities. The other thing is, on a more practical level, middle college and dual enrollment is a real game changer. Now, when I went to the high school, I had the benefit of I was one of the schools that was an early adopter in that. By the time I started at college, I already had almost a year's worth of credits, and because of what I was able to get in high school, and through a local community college, and that was a huge advantage. And then I continued to go to community college while I was going to a university. It brought the cost way down overall. The middle college is even better. So you can spend 5 years in high school but graduate with an associate's degree and have half of a university degree already paid for without any cost at all to the student. Those are some practical changes, but we also have to expect that universities adopt the same sort of cost controls that the rest of government has over the last 7 or 8 years. I mean, we have made cost control, taken cost control measures, local governments have, but largely universities haven't. And so as we have been trying to increase funding for universities, I think that we should do that in tandem with them taking cost control measures, so that you're doing both at the same time. You're bringing down the overall cost by additional state support, and also cost control, and students having all the options where they have the incentive to keep the cost down in the first place.
We talk a little bit of higher ed. Now let's look at some preschool options. Aaron?
What can the state do about the high cost of childcare and the lack of preschool options for young children?
There's a really exciting thing happening right now that I'm so proud of, that is off the ground and launched now in Flint. There are two centers. One is Great Expectations, and the other one is Educare. And this was when I had moved my office to Flint in 2016. I worked with a lot of different groups of people on important things for the city to start moving forward in early childhood education, early executive development of the brain, proper nutrition, health care, all the things in developmental delay screening, all these things that were so important for kids 0 to 5. it seemed like there were programs, but they were in different silos, different locations, different intake criteria, and so it worked like a bunch of programs instead of a system. And so what I brought everybody together. So it was the school district and the ISD and Great Start and Head Start and the local congressman's office was there to help with some of the federal issues. I had people in the Department of Health and Human Services and different programs there as well. And we do, we do daycare subsidies and Medicaid and food stamps and Great Start and Head Start, all these different things early on. All right, so how can we, instead of doing all these programs, could we blend these funding streams together and have full-time, year-round, high-quality, 0 to 5 daycare, childcare, early education, early literacy, developmental delay screening, interventions, helping the parents get back on their feet? Could we just do that together in one place instead of like in 10 different places? And there was a million reasons why it wouldn't work, but everybody worked together to make it happen. And we started with Cummings Elementary School, which is a closed elementary school, and the Mott Foundation made it like new, and it reopened as this new thing. And then the Mott Foundation built a brand new building, and the University of Michigan Flint is in there as well. They do the early childhood education, but they're also tracking the progress of the kids, and to see the difference it makes in them starting kindergarten ready to learn and how much better they'll do after that. All of those entities together, I mean, I'm just so excited about what this could mean. And on paper, it looks like it's expensive. But if you look, we do all those things anyway in other places and other ways in other parts of the budget. And by bringing them together, you're dealing with all of these different facets and problems at the same time. So when you have an area that has a lot of non-educational barriers to learning, then there are enough kids that qualify for enough things. You can just provide all those things on site full time year round, and so it's revolutionary for Michigan. I'm pumped about it. I think that if you read my education white paper, the early education part of it, it's based on the work that I and many others did in Educare in Flint.
Lieutenant Governor, before we leave the topic of education, I want to ask you something that you talked to Aaron a little bit about, was about the governance structure of the Michigan Department of Education. Do you think that should change? Do you think the governor should be appointing the State Board of Education and then therefore appointing the superintendent? Would you change anything about the makeup of the MDE?
That's a constitutional issue, and I think you can make a strong argument for making a change, but I'm not really interested in. I don't think that's really the problem. The governance and how people are elected and selected to go on the ballot and that sort of thing. When you bring a unifying approach and you have a new and a better mission for the Department of Education, I think that organization itself is going to do better. But to go off on try and get a constitutional amendment to try out another governance structure to see if it works any better than the current one, I just think that's a whole lot of time and energy that ought to be spent on the mission of the Department of Education as opposed to the governance structure of it in the first place.